This is episode 321 of That Shakespeare Life. Access even more Shakespeare history when you join us as a patron on Patreon. Sign up today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Richard Shook, Professor of Drama at Queen's University, Belfast in Northern Ireland. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
In addition to testing the food themselves and kissing the napkins and licking the silverware, would wave the horn slowly over the royal table. And they'd sometimes dip it into the food and drink for good measure. And then they would look at it to see if it's starting to shake or sweat.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
From Hamlet's father being murdered by poison to Romeo killing himself when he drinks poison, and several instances of hemlock, dragon scales, hebenon, and others in between, Shakespeare utilizes poison as a dramatic device in several of his works. The use of poison was not just an easy tool for a plot twist, however, since poison was both a pervasive fear at all levels of society, as well as a convenient and readily available method to dispatch someone, given that poison was incredibly hard to track back to the criminal that administered it. The fear of poison was exacerbated by a broad ignorance of chemistry, resulting in many of the accepted treatments for illness being, in themselves, poison. Syphilis was routinely treated with mercury, for example, which is toxic. Doctors as well as monarchs have developed elaborate and unusual tactics for both the prevention and cure for poison, while those seeking to overthrow a monarch or take out their enemy used poison to come up with some sophisticated and complex designs for murder. Here today to share with us the history of real poisons from Shakespeare's lifetime, used for both medical treatments as well as criminal application, as well as some ordinary items no one even realized was trying to kill them, is our guest and author of The Royal Art of Poison, Filthy Palaces, Fatal Cosmetics, Deadly Medicine, and Murder Most Foul. We're delighted to welcome Eleanor Herman to the show today. Eleanor Herman is a New York Times best-selling author, historian, and host for TV shows on both History Channel and National Geographic Channel. She joins us today to discuss her book titled The Royal Art of Poison, Filthy Palaces, Fatal Cosmetics, Deadly Medicine, and Murder Most Foul. In this book, she explores the history of poison and toxins, including those that were present in the life of William Shakespeare. Learn more about Eleanor and other historical fiction works that she's written in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Eleanor. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
We've read about royal families having official taste testers whose job it was to prevent the monarch from being poisoned. But one fact that surprised me from Eleanor's book was the use of unicorn horns in this endeavor. Eleanor, how were unicorn horns used as poison prevention?
Well, unicorn horns were valued in the Renaissance for being able to detect poison by sweating and trembling in its presence. So before the monarch ate even the tiniest tidbit, his tasters, in addition to testing the food themselves and kissing the napkins and licking the silverware, would wave the horn slowly over the royal table. And they'd sometimes dip it into the food and drink for good measure. And then they would look at it to see if it's starting to shake or sweat. And many people believe that unicorn horns could render the poison itself harmless, not just detect it. For instance, in the 16th century, the physicians of the Doge of Venice threw unicorn horns into the palace well so that the water there could never be poisoned to the extent to kill the Doge. And these unicorn horns were incredibly expensive. In the 16th century, King Charles IX of France received an offer of 100,000 crowns for his, which he flatly refused. Around the same time, Ivan the Terrible of Russia had one worth 70,000 rubles. And Queen Elizabeth of England had a 7-foot-long spiral unicorn horn valued at 10,000 pounds, which at the time would have been the cost of a decent-sized castle. And her privateer, Martin Frobisher, had found it on a beach in 1577 on what later became Canada. So she was sure that this unicorn horn would save her from assassination attempts. She also drank from a unicorn horn cup that was supposed to explode when poison was introduced, never exploded. We all might well wonder, where did people find unicorn horns, which have always been and still are incredibly rare? The fact is that these so-called unicorn horns were actually the tusks of an Arctic whale called a narwhal. It had one funny long tusk on one side of his face. This creature was not discovered until the 18th century. And until then, Europeans marveled at the fact that all the unicorns in the world seemed to go to northern beaches to die.
So they were finding narwhal horns, but not seeing the narwhal itself and just assuming there was some mystical horse with a horn on it running around the Arctic.
Well, they knew about unicorns from mythology going back long before. And when they found these huge horns on the northern beaches, they thought that, a unicorn had shed his horn or perhaps had died. And so they just found this horn and they're like, wow, this is going to save us all from poison. And given the cost of a unicorn horn that royals were paying one another or giving as gifts, it was really quite a find. It was like digging up a chest of gold pieces.
Well, you've mentioned that the unicorn horn not only detected poison, but was also used to render the poison inert and not something that could harm people. And I wonder about other poison antidotes. What were the most reliable antidotes against poison? And how was this tested? How was it determined that this is the best thing to prevent poison?
There were antidotes that were called Mithridates. After a 1st century BC king of Pontus in what's now Turkey, he feared poisoning so much that he ingested bits of poison every day to develop immunity. And these concoctions, we have many of the recipes, they had a lot of non-poisonous ingredients, like cooking ingredients, right? Carrots, cinnamon, parsley, and that kind of thing. But many also included powdered vipers and scorpions. And there's a book of recipes from the 16th century that I've read, and these recipes are really complex. They took weeks and even months to make. I can't imagine that any of them would have been truly helpful as antidotes to poison. I just think they made royalty feel better when they went down to eat at the banquet. There were 2 antidotes used in the 16th century that doctors still use today. There are certain kinds of clay that absorb heavy metal-based poisons such as arsenic, mercury, and lead. And they neutralize it so it doesn't absorb into the bloodstream. And then the poison goes out of the body together with the clay. And the second one works in a similar way. There were things called toadstones or tungstones. They were highly valued. They were believed to be semi-precious stones taken from the belly of a toad, but they were actually fossilized shark teeth. And interestingly, when the calcium carbonate in fossils is mixed with arsenic, it neutralizes the poison by mopping up the arsenic molecules in a chemical process. It's called chelation. I think I'm saying that right. And today's doctors sometimes use chelation to neutralize mercury, arsenic, and most heavy metals. So these are 2 Renaissance poison antidotes that I think might actually have worked. Now, your second question is, how were these things tested? There were poison factories. One very famous one was in Florence. Another was in Venice. And they had chemists working on creating antidotes. They would test them on animals. And then when it came to testing them on human beings, they did something very interesting. They would haul out some condemned criminals from prison and say, look, we're going to present you with a deal. You can either get hanged tomorrow at dawn, or you can volunteer to take this wine with arsenic mixed in and then try our antidote. And if the antidote works and you survive, you're a free man. If it doesn't, you're going to die anyway. So there were several reports that I found in researching my book where this occurred. Sometimes the guy did walk out. He, maybe he was a little sick, but he survived. There's one case where the poor soul suffered for a couple of days in the worst agony because the antidote didn't work. And he said that he wished he had just agreed to be hanged. It would have been much quicker.
Wow. That's a rough gamble to take for anybody.
Which one would you pick?
I hope I never have to make that choice. Now, Eleanor's book identifies that servants not only licked spoons to test for poison, but would sometimes even try on their master's underpants. Eleanor, why was there a fear of poisoned underwear?
In the 16th century, people believed that arsenic and other poisons could get into the bloodstream through the skin and kill the person. And so they were really terrified in coming into contact with it. What they didn't know is that these poisons could not have killed anyone in that way. Like, let's say you touched something that was loaded with arsenic. You would have felt a kind of burning, maybe developed a slight rash. You would have washed it off, and that would have been the end of it. And today's poisons, however, are different. The kind of nuclear-based ones coming out of Russia are so lethal that if you even touch a few molecules of it, it can kill you. There was a case a few years ago where an assassin had smeared some poison on a doorknob at a home in England where two dissidents were living, and they both almost died. But that's what they thought could happen in the 16th century. They had no idea that it actually could not.
One major poison for Elizabeth I in particular was makeup. Now, this one's interesting because I don't think the Queen recognized that her makeup was poisonous. Eleanor, explain for us what made her makeup poisonous.
Well, in 1562, Elizabeth almost died from smallpox. And though she fully recovered, she did have a few small scars on her face. So at that point, she started using makeup that was the fashion in Italy on her face, neck, and chest. It's called a ceruse foundation. And it was this pasty mixture consisting of a tincture of white lead, vinegar, and sometimes arsenic and hydroxide and carbonate. These are all toxic things. And it was applied over egg whites. You put egg whites first on your face, and then this thing, the ceruse would fill in the smallpox pits, and it would have given her this startling, almost silvery whiteness to her face. Unfortunately, over time, the lead would absorb through the skin, and it can result in hair loss, muscle paralysis, violent mood swings. And ironically, over time, it also corroded the skin. So it created pits and blemishes and blotches so that the user would have to dollop on more of the stuff to hide the damage and thereby cause more damage. And it also dried out the skin and caused wrinkles. At the time, people did get that it was, it made you look older. Over time, it made women sick. And I guess depending on their DNA, everybody reacted differently. Some people got very sick within a year or two. Some of them died. Queen Elizabeth must have had a really hardy constitution because she lived another 40 years after she started using this stuff. She also used mercury, which we know now is poisonous. She probably used arsenic face powder over the mercury face paint. And she definitely applied vermilion, you can see in the portraits of her, which is powdered cinnabar, which contains mercury, to her cheeks and lips. So for 40 years, every day, the Queen coated her face with a variety of toxic materials. The ladies at her court and everywhere else who could afford it followed suit and poisoned themselves. So we can only wonder how many early deaths of Elizabethan ladies with languishing symptoms can be attributed to their deadly cosmetics. Now, the last decade of her life, and she lived to be 69, her appetite vanished. She wasted away. She had these violent mood swings. She would stomp around talking to herself, imagining assassins hiding behind the tapestries. She was terrible to her ladies in waiting and threw things at them. Sometimes she sat in her chamber in the dark weeping. So back in the 1590s, people who saw this personality change assumed that she was just old because being in your 60s back then was sort of like being in your 80s or 90s right now. So you're at the end of a long life. And of course, you're going to have naturally diminishing physical and mental abilities. But in the past few years, some experts believe that these changes in the Queen's personality could have been the result of decades of cosmetic and medical poisoning by lead, mercury, and arsenic.
Well, now, besides makeup, what are some other things that would have been considered ordinary for people to use that were actually poisons, or even worse, were thought to be recognized medical treatments?
So mercury was used to treat a variety of ailments. I mean, you just think about how beautiful it is. It's silvery, it rolls around. At the time, doctors and so-called scientists thought it was just a magical element, and as such must help human health. It was used for treating constipation, and since it's poisonous, it was quite effective for that particular ailment, as it would certainly get your bowels moving quickly. They also used arsenic and mercury skin cream on rashes or skin infections, which actually could work in tiny trace amounts, like just a couple of grains, let's say, of arsenic in a big blob of, skin cream. If you would rub it on the affected patch of skin, it could indeed kill a bacterial infection, because just the tiniest bits of poison would kill the bacteria without necessarily harming you if you just applied it once in a while, not on a daily basis. The really gross thing that they did, which was a shocker to me when I started researching this book, was they would take dead body parts from executed criminals and they would pound them into something to drink or to swallow, because they had this belief that if particularly a young, healthy person were killed suddenly, like they were beheaded or they were hanged, that the vitality of that person's normal lifespan, had it not been cut short, was retained in the body parts, in the flesh, in the blood, in the bones and muscles. So they would chop it up into medical concoctions. And they also used animal dung, either hot and wet or dried and powdered. They would smear it on wounds. I think about all of the bacteria in feces of any kind and how that must have spread infections. In terms of the heavy metal poisons, they cause birth defects, kidney and liver problems, tremors, black teeth that fell out, all kinds of things. Another thing they did was, for some reason, they thought it would be helpful to cut birds in half, pigeons, roosters, chickens, and then apply them still bleeding to the shaved heads of a person who was really sick. They thought that this would draw out all of the evil humors in the head, and doctors used this so-called remedy on Henry, Prince of Wales in 1612, and in 1685 on King Charles II, both of whom died. And sometimes these dead birds were not removed in a timely manner. They were left to putrefy. Must have stunk, caused infection. They were left on for days, rotting. And there's really nothing more infectious than a decomposing corpse.
That all sounds perfectly horrible. I can't believe that it's surprising to me that they not only came up with this in the first place, but that they would try it unsuccessfully repeatedly. This is not working, but they're still continuing to do it, is, I think, what's surprising to me most about those stories.
What happened was the medical community, even back then, they had their tried and true and accepted treatments. Even when it was clear they didn't work, they did not want to accept that, because they'd spent years studying this stuff. They'd spent, in some cases, decades treating people with this nonsense. They didn't want to admit they were wrong. And there was a late 16th century royal doctor of France, Ambroise Paré, who did not go through the regular treatment to become a physician. He was a barber surgeon, which was a lower level, and he was a battlefield doctor. And on the battlefield, you pretty much could do whatever you want. If somebody's leg was blown off, you didn't have to get a book and start going through all of these treatments. So he came up with new treatments that were much more helpful in saving his patients than all of these, these book treatments that have been around for centuries. And when he became very well known and wrote a book about it, the established medical community tried to have him blacklisted, tried to have the royal family fire him because they just didn't want to hear that their stuff wasn't working.
Don't go against the flow or challenge, what's happening. Now, of course, I think one of the most famous applications of poison is when it is used for murder. Eleanor, what kinds of poisons were used to murder someone in the 16th and 17th century?
Well, that had changed. In earlier centuries, the plant-based poisons had been used, so poison mushrooms, henbane, digitalis, and wolfsbane. But by the 1500s, arsenic became the most popular poison as scholars and proto-chemists had learned to prepare it in such a way that it was a tasteless, colorless, and odorless powder. And no one ever really knew if they were drinking wine or they were eating something. You couldn't really tell if arsenic was in it. The most famous case of arsenic poisoning was that of Sir Thomas Overbury. And in 1613, Overbury died of arsenic poisoning in the Tower of London, where James I had placed him for a time to cool his heels for insulting the Queen. This was not a death sentence. He was going to let him out. But his poisoning had been orchestrated by Frances Howard, Countess of Sussex, who was furious at Overbury for having written a poem about her, referencing her sexual impropriety. So she sent poisoned tarts to him in prison and finished him off with a poisoned enema, ouch, administered by a doctor in her employ. And this all came out in the most scandalous court case of the whole century. And interestingly, Overbury is buried at the altar of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London, right along with Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. So he does rest at least in a very well-known, well-visited place.
So he got his revenge in the end.
I think the king was really horrified about what happened to him. I mean, Overbury had worked for James for many years in some diplomatic ways, and he never wanted him to die there. And so I think he had him buried there in a place of great honor just because he was really sorry.
Almost like an apology from the king. Of
an apology for arsenic enema. How far
Which
that
is
went.
The least you can do, I think, at that point. Now, there are many individuals in Eleanor's work whose stories with poison are shared in her book, and I definitely suggest that you read this to get much more history. And there are several stories that overlap with the life of Shakespeare, like Thomas Overbury. But one that I want to point out today is the story of Henry Stuart, the Prince of Wales. Eleanor, what is Henry's story of poison?
Oh, it's such a sad story. Prince Henry was the oldest son of James I. And he was a healthy, athletic young man. And then at the age of 18, it was 1612, he developed a fever, headaches, and diarrhea. So his doctors, there were a dozen of them, gave him laxatives. And even though the guy had diarrhea, why would you give him laxatives? So that 25 times a day, he would have to have enema to rid him of the evil humors. The guy must have suffered terribly from dehydration. And the lead doctor was a Frenchman named Theodore de Mayerne. He was really afraid that he would be blamed if the heir to the throne died. So every day he wrote really detailed notes about the prince's symptoms and the treatments, which have helped modern doctors determine what actually killed the prince. So oddly, his doctors at the time thought he had become sick by eating too much fruit, which created an imbalance in his humor. So to balance his humors, they shaved his head, they applied hot glass cups to his scalp and blistered it to allow the putrid humors of his brain to escape. They split roosters and pigeons in half and tied the bloody carcasses to his head. They caused him to repeatedly vomit, and they bled him copiously. So after an illness lasting 27 days, the boy died. And rumors of poison spread across Europe, which is what always happened. Even if an illness, lasted weeks, months, even years, it's, poison finished them off. So it was either the French who had poisoned him, maybe slowly, maybe one of them was one of his doctors, or the Pope, or the enemies of Sir Walter Raleigh, who was in the Tower of London. And Prince Henry had been trying to convince his father to let him go from the tower and free him. There was even thought that perhaps King James himself had killed his own son because he was jealous of the boy's popularity. So Theodore de Mayerne performed an autopsy the day after Henry died. He examined all the organs, wrote what he found, even though he had very little idea what he was actually looking at. And he reported that the stomach was without any manner of fault or imperfection, which alone ruled out poison, which would cause the stomach to be red and inflamed. So modern doctors have identified the prince's cause of death as typhoid fever, which Henry could have caught by swimming in the fecal waters of the Thames, which he loved to do, or eating raw oysters. And the irony of this whole story is, the true tragedy is that given Henry's youth and good health, if the doctors had left him alone and he had been given bed rest and chicken soup, he may very well have survived. And if he had, his younger brother Charles would never have become king, and the English Civil War would probably never have happened.
That's a huge if. That is so amazing to me. That's such a misstep in understanding things like bacteria and the impact of these balancing of the humors and thinking that that's what he needed. It's just amazing what hindsight can do for you. Now, I know we would love to learn more about this topic and explore the various poisons and toxins that were available for Shakespeare's lifetime. And definitely Eleanor's book is a great place to start. But Eleanor, as someone who has researched this topic extensively in the writing of your book, I wonder if you could give us some expert recommendations on where we should begin if we would like to study this topic further.
Well, first of all, you could start with my book. In terms of other books that particularly focus on Shakespeare's lifetime, I would recommend a book called The Lost Prince, The Life and Death of Henry Stuart. It's by Catherine MacLeod, Macleod, came out in 2012. And, it just looks at his life, his death, the court of James I. It's really beautifully done with lots of photographs. The second one is called Unnatural Murder, Poison at the Court of James I. It's written by Anne Somerset, Somerset, came out in 1997. And this is the story of Sir Thomas Overbury's arsenic poisoning, with these amazing complex details of sex and lies and beauty and villainy at the royal court of James I. It's just unbelievable that the story played out the way it did. The third one, which I absolutely love, is called The Secrets of the Reverend Mester Alexis of Piemont, Piement, containing excellent remedies against diverse diseases, wounds, and other accidents, with the manner to make distillations, perfumes, configures, dyeings, colors, fusions, and meltings. It's a rather long title. Printed in London. Got to be
a primary source, yes.
It is. Printed in London by Thomas Wright. It came out in English in 1595. No, unfortunately, I do not have an original copy, but you can look it up, go into different libraries, and it will bring up page by page, like the original sort of yellowed pages of this book. And I printed the whole thing out and studied it. For instance, it includes a recipe for a face mask of mercury to be left on for an entire week and then wiped off with bread. Imagine mercury on your face for a week. I mean, I guess it was an exfoliator or something. You're supposed to have a very, shiny, glowing skin after that. There's also a recipe for a liquid gold drink used to combat aging. It was kind of the Botox of the time. And this potion, you're supposed to drink it once a month. The French royal mistress, Diane de Poitiers, was 19 years older than her royal lover, Francois II. So she drank this gold mixture every day. And when she died in 1566, no one exactly knew what killed her. But then her body was dug up in 2010. And the researchers who found it said the gold around it gleamed and sparkled. The ground around it gleamed and sparkled with gold because her intestines and innards were so full of gold, which doesn't really come out of your system, that it just sort of decayed with her body and it was just saturating the ground.
She had just poisoned herself trying to help herself. Oh my goodness.
Which many people did at the time.
Well, we will place links to Eleanor's book along with these recommended resources, and the primary document from 1595 is available on archive.org, and I have found the link to that, so I will place that in the show notes for today's episode, so make sure you go there to find all of this really great history and places to start if you'd like to explore the history of poisons and toxins just a little bit further. Now, Eleanor, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Because those would have been my two first picks. I might pick the works of Homer, so the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is along the same lines for me as the Bible and Shakespeare's works, because they're just so full of history, of human dysfunction, of good, of evil, of beauty, and violence. And then there are the works of Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Buddhist monk who died last year in his 90s. And it's the opposite of all the dysfunction and violence of all those other iconic works. You know, it looks at oneness, at beauty, at forgiveness of the human spirit. And it is an antidote, a real one, for my spirit, since I spend so much time in the dysfunctional past.
Well, I think that seems like a very fitting selection for your deserted island visit. So that's a good choice. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
You know, I just moved to Williamsburg, Virginia 3 weeks ago, and I am surrounding myself with my favorite antiques I've been collecting for decades. I actually have a chair from Shakespeare's time, and it's riddled with wormwood holes, which I love. My husband said, "Why do you want that rotten, ratty old chair with the holes in it?" Well, these wormwood holes prove its antiquity. I think about the people who sat in it 400 years ago. So it's right by my desk. I just love looking at it. I have a collection of 17th century documents, wills, firearms, all kinds of really cool things. I'm just now getting myself set up in this new life, and I'm not working on a new project at the moment. Oh, but I do have a movie deal in the works, which is very fascinating, except I can't talk about it yet.
Well, what fun things. It sounds like just a great place to be, and we're very happy for you on your move. Congratulations. And we look forward to hearing about your movie project sometime in the future when it does come to fruition. Thank you so much, Eleanor Herman, for being here with us today and sharing with us the history from your book, The Royal Art of Poison. It has been really fun talking with you. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Cassidy.
As I promised, the entire list of resources Eleanor recommends for you today, including those primary documents that talk with you about the recipes for poison antidotes, is included in the show notes for today's episode. You can find these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 320. That's CassidyCash.com/EP320. Now, while you're on the show notes page, if you would like even more in-depth history about the poisons and toxins we're talking about today, including woodcuts, illustrations, more primary documents, and even museum artifacts related to poison from the 16th and 17th century, as well as some direct connections with Shakespeare and his plays for this topic, then use the Become a Patron button to log in with your Patreon credentials, and all the bonus content will expand right there on the show notes page. If you're not already a patron, you can use that button to join our Patreon community and start exploring all the insider extras for this episode and the entire CassidyCash.com website. Again, the show notes for this week are CassidyCash.com/episode 320. That Shakespeare Life is supported by listeners like you who join us as patrons. Patrons of our show get unlimited access to our detailed show notes, over 150 bonus episodes of our show, and special insider extras, including a video library, animated versions of Shakespeare's plays, and a collection of educator resources that includes hands-on history activity kits, lesson plans, and a 35-week syllabus that outlines how to take your podcast right into your classroom studies of Shakespeare's plays. Find out more, explore all the extras, and sign up today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Naholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.